metallic tang hit my tongue before I even opened the lab door. 3 years of materials engineering at the Meridian Advanced Composites facility, and I'd never tasted oxidation this strong in the morning air. My keycard beeped against the scanner. The LED flashed red twice before accepting, unusual for the new synthetic housings we'd installed last month. Inside, the fluorescent strips flickered intermittently, their synthetic diffuser panels showing hairline stress fractures that cast unstable shadows across the surfaces I'd left spotless 12 hours ago. Except they weren't pristine anymore. Orange-brown patches sprawled across the polycarbonate workbenches like infectious wounds. I stopped mid-step, coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. The corrosion followed no logical pattern, random blooms and streaks that looked almost organic in their chaotic spread. But that was impossible. These weren't metal surfaces. I set my coffee down with trembling fingers and pulled out my phone, snapping photos from multiple angles. The rust formations were roughly circular, maybe 6 inches in diameter, with finger-like extensions reaching toward the lab's ventilation grates. The synthetic flooring showed similar damage, tiles curling at the edges where the corrosion had somehow penetrated the polymer matrix. What the hell? The words escaped before I could stop them. My workstation monitor flickered as I approached. The synthetic frame around the screen showed hairline cracks radiating from rust spots no bigger than pinheads. I tapped the power button twice, nothing. The screen remained dead, its LED status light dark. I grabbed my tablet from the charging dock, relieved when it powered on normally. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the wireless signal bars flickered between 1 and 0. Our building's network infrastructure used synthetic fiber optic housings throughout. The facility's morning status report should have been running automatically. Instead, I found a handwritten note taped to my secondary monitor. Primary systems down for maintenance V. Vale never left handwritten notes. Everything went through the digital work order system, and he'd been pushing us toward paperless operations for months. Something had forced him to resort to pen and paper. I accessed the overnight environmental logs through my tablet, expecting to find some anomaly that might explain the impossible corrosion. The data made my stomach clench. Temperature, normal. Humidity, within acceptable range. Chemical sensors, all green. But the timestamp stopped at 11:47 p.m., exactly when my synthesis experiment had completed its cooling cycle. My synthesis experiment, the failed polymer enhancement test I'd been running for 6 months, trying to create self-healing synthetic materials. The one that had produced nothing but a small vial of cloudy liquid that I'd sealed and labeled for disposal this morning. The vial sat exactly where I'd left it in the containment unit. Still sealed, still labeled. But the containment unit's synthetic gasket was crumbling around the edges, orange flakes falling onto the metal base like diseased snow. I backed away from the unit, my pulse hammering in my ears. Synthesis reactions didn't work like this. Polymers didn't spontaneously corrode. And they definitely didn't cause metallic oxidation on non-metallic surfaces. Unless they weren't just polymers anymore. My hand shook as I reached for the emergency phone mounted near the exit. The plastic receiver was sticky with rust-colored residue that hadn't been there yesterday. I lifted it to my ear anyway and dialed Thalen's extension. Environmental safety, this is the Lin. It's Nilo. I need you in Lab 7 immediately. What's wrong? You sound. Just come. Now. And bring your detection equipment. I hung up and stared at the spreading corrosion. In the few minutes since I'd arrived, the patches seemed to have grown. Not much, maybe a millimeter or 2, but enough to notice if you were looking for it, which meant this wasn't overnight damage. This was active, ongoing, still happening. The photo of my sister and her kids that I kept on my desk caught my eye. Maya had sent it last week, them playing in their backyard in Seattle, surrounded by their synthetic playground equipment, their composite deck furniture, their polymer-sided shed. Everything modern life depended on. Everything that might be vulnerable to whatever I'd created. The lab door's access panel beeped as someone approached from outside. Through the reinforced window, I could see Thalen's concerned face, her auburn hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she always wore for fieldwork. She was carrying her atmospheric monitoring kit, good thinking. But as I reached for the door release, I noticed something that made me freeze. The synthetic door frame was developing rust spots around the electronic lock mechanism. Tiny ones, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. But they were there, and they were growing. Whatever I'd synthesized wasn't just corroding surfaces in my lab. It was affecting the entire building's infrastructure. And if it could spread through the ventilation system, through contact with personnel, through any of a dozen possible vectors. I pressed the door release, my mind racing through containment protocols. Belin stepped inside, already raising her detection wand toward the air. Jesus, Nilo. What did you? She stopped mid-sentence, staring at the corrupted workbenches. This is synthetic material. This shouldn't be possible. I know. My voice sounded hollow even to myself. Belin, I think we need to evacuate the building. She looked at me sharply. Based on what? Unexplained corrosion? The protocols require. The protocols assume we're dealing with known threats. I gestured toward my failed experiment's containment unit. This isn't in any manual. Her detection equipment was beeping steadily, a low electronic whine that meant elevated levels of something. She frowned at the readout, tapping the screen with a gloved finger. I'm getting atmospheric particulates, but the chemical signature isn't matching anything in our database. And the concentration is. She looked up at me with widening eyes. Nilo, it's increasing. Rapidly. Through the lab's observation window, I could see other researchers arriving for their morning shifts. Dr. Ezra was unlocking the adjacent materials lab, completely unaware of what might be waiting inside. In the distance, Vale's office light was already on. He'd probably been here since 6 a.m., running damage control on whatever crisis had taken our systems offline. Normal people, starting a normal day, walking into a building that was slowly dissolving around them. I had two choices: sound the evacuation alarm based on incomplete data and potentially destroy my career over a false alarm, or stay and gather more evidence while risking everyone's safety if this was as dangerous as it appeared. The rust patches on my workbench had definitely grown since I'd first noticed them. Not by much, but measurably, and the metallic taste in the air was getting stronger. We need more data, I said, surprising myself, before we can make any recommendations. The Lin nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Okay, but we work fast and we work safe. Full protective equipment, and if this gets any worse, we'll know when to call it, I finished. But as I reached for my protective gear, I caught sight of my reflection in the lab's polished metal cabinet door. Behind me, visible through the observation window, Dr. Ezra was examining something on her workbench with obvious confusion. Something orange-brown that shouldn't have been there when she'd left last night. The containment unit's seal gave a soft hiss as the internal pressure equalized with the lab atmosphere. Whatever I'd created wasn't staying contained anymore, and we were already too late to stop it from spreading. 30 minutes later, the building's synthetic infrastructure was dying around us like a cancer patient in fast forward. Thalin's atmospheric readings climbed steadily as we moved through the corridors, her detection equipment whining with increasing urgency. The synthetic wall panels showed stress fractures that hadn't existed during my morning walkthrough. Worse, the emergency lighting strips were failing in sequence, their polymer housings crumbling into rust-colored powder that crunched under our boots. Nilo. The Lin grabbed my arm, pointing toward the main elevator bank. The synthetic call buttons were dissolving, leaving behind corroded holes in the wall panel like acid burns. We need to get everyone out of the upper floors while the stairwells are still intact. The stairwells. Jesus. The emergency stairs use synthetic reinforcement in their concrete matrix, a cost-saving measure from the facility's construction 5 years ago. If the corrosion agent was affecting polymer matrices at the molecular level, how long do we have? I asked. She checked her readings again, her face pale behind the respirator we'd grabbed from the emergency supply. At this rate of atmospheric concentration increase? Maybe 2 hours before the air becomes toxic. Less if the ventilation system keeps circulating it. Less if the ventilation system's synthetic components failed completely and we lost all air circulation. But I didn't say that aloud. We'd managed to evacuate labs 6 through 9 without triggering the building-wide alarm, moving people to the older East Wing, where the construction predated synthetic building materials. Dr. Ezra had been cooperative once she'd seen her own workbench dissolving, but the evacuation was raising questions I wasn't ready to answer. Where's Vale? I asked as we reached the central corridor. His office door stood open, but the space was empty except for his coffee mug sitting on a desk increasingly covered in rust-colored dust from the deteriorating ceiling tiles. He was coordinating with the city emergency services, the Lin said. Something about a controlled assessment of the situation. My stomach dropped. Controlled by whom? Before she could answer, the building's PA system crackled to life, A burst of static that resolved into Vale's familiar voice, but stressed in a way I'd never heard before. All personnel, this is a building-wide notification. Due to an ongoing materials integrity assessment, all staff are required to relocate to the East Wing conference rooms until further notice. This is not a drill, but there is no immediate danger. Repeat, relocate to East Wing conference rooms. No immediate danger. Right. I watched a section of synthetic baseboard simply crumble away from the wall as we passed, leaving behind a trail of orange powder. Nilo. The Lynn stopped walking, her voice tight with concern. My readings just spiked. Whatever's happening, it's accelerating. I looked at her detection equipment. The atmospheric particulate levels had doubled in the past 10 minutes. And the chemical signature was evolving. The molecular composition was changing as we watched, becoming more complex. It's adapting, I said, the words tasting like metal and defeat. The corrosion agent is breaking down different synthetic polymers and incorporating their molecular components into itself. Which meant it wasn't just destroying synthetic materials. It was learning from them, becoming more effective with each new type of polymer it encountered. We needed to reach the East Wing before the main corridor's structural integrity failed. But as we approached the junction that would take us to safety, I heard something that made me freeze. Voices, coming from the West Wing, the area we'd been trying to evacuate. That's some of the senior research staff, the Lynn said, checking her tablet. They were supposed to evacuate with the others. Senior staff, the department heads who'd been pressuring me for months to share my synthesis research, who'd made several pointed comments about how breakthrough discoveries shouldn't be kept in isolation, who would have access to the building's after-hours systems, who could have tampered with my containment protocols. The Lynn, I said carefully, when you checked the overnight logs, was there any record of unauthorized lab access? She was quiet for a moment, her fingers dancing across her tablet screen. The system shows some irregular badge scans around 10 p.m. last night, but the records are fragmentary. Looks like whoever accessed the system knew how to minimize their digital footprint. 10 p.m., an hour before my experiment completed its cooling cycle. An hour before the environmental monitoring timestamp stopped. The voices from the West Wing were getting louder, argumentative, and one of them definitely belonged to Vale. We need to know what they're discussing, I said. The Lynn shot me a look that clearly said this was a terrible idea, but she followed as I moved toward the West Wing corridor. The synthetic flooring here was in worse condition, bubbled and cracking in places where the polymer matrix had weakened. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the building's acoustics were changing along with its structural integrity. Told you this was a possibility, Vale was saying as we got close enough to make out words. The synthesis research was always high risk. Risk implies uncertainty. That was Dr. Ezra's voice, sharp with frustration. This was predictable if proper safeguards had been followed. Proper safeguards? A third voice I didn't immediately recognize. The containment protocols were deliberately circumvented. Someone wanted this to happen. My hands went cold despite the building's rising temperature. Deliberately circumvented. Someone had sabotaged my experiment. But why? What possible benefit could come from creating an agent that destroyed synthetic materials? Unless that had been the goal all along. The Lynn grabbed my shoulder, pointing toward her detection equipment. The atmospheric readings were climbing exponentially now. Whatever was happening in the West Wing, it was accelerating the corrosion process throughout the building. We need to get out, she whispered. Now. The air quality is approaching toxic levels. But I could hear more of the conversation now, and what I was hearing made my chest tight with a panic that had nothing to do with atmospheric toxins. Global implications if this spreads beyond the facility. Synthetic supply chains throughout the Pacific Northwest. Military applications alone would justify the development costs. Military applications. They weren't talking about an accident. They were talking about a weapon. A weapon that could destroy every piece of synthetic infrastructure in a target area. Transportation systems, communication networks, building materials, protective equipment. Everything modern civilization depended on. And I'd been the one to create it. The building shuddered around us, a low groaning that seemed to come from the structural supports themselves. Through the corridor windows, I could see emergency vehicles gathering in the parking area. Fire trucks, hazmat response units, and several unmarked black SUVs that definitely weren't local emergency services. The Lynn, I said, my voice barely steady. We need to get to the East Wing. But first, I need to access my lab data. Your lab data? She stared at me like I'd suggested walking into a furnace. Nilo, the West Wing is collapsing. The air is toxic. Your lab equipment is probably already destroyed. Not the equipment. The backup drives. I pulled out my key card, surprised to find it still functional despite the rust stains around the magnetic strip. The synthesis process, the molecular formulas, the containment protocols, everything's backed up on hardened drives in my desk safe. Why does that matter now? Because if this was intentional sabotage, if someone had turned my research into a weapon, then the backup data might be the only way to develop a neutralization agent. Or it might be evidence of how the containment had been compromised. Or it might be what the people in those black SUVs were really here to retrieve. The building shuddered again, more violently this time. Chunks of synthetic insulation fell from the ceiling like diseased snow, and I could hear the distinct sound of structural supports beginning to fail. 2 minutes, I said. Give me 2 minutes to get the drives, and then we evacuate with everyone else. Thalen's expression behind her respirator was equal parts frustration and fear. But she nodded. 2 minutes, she agreed. But if this building starts coming down around us, I'm dragging you out whether you have your data or not. We started toward Lab 7, moving as quickly as the deteriorating floor would allow. Behind us, the voices from the West Wing had gone silent. Either the conversation had ended, or the building's failing acoustics could no longer carry sound through the compromised structure. As we reached my lab door, I caught a glimpse of movement through the observation window. Someone in a hazmat suit was inside, working at my containment unit with what looked like sample collection equipment. Someone who definitely wasn't part of our research team. Someone who'd been waiting for us to leave so they could collect samples of what I'd accidentally created, or what someone had manipulated me into creating. Thalen's detection equipment began beeping frantically, the readings spiking beyond anything we'd seen so far. And through the lab's ventilation grates, I could see a faint orange mist beginning to circulate, the corrosion agent going airborne in concentrations that would make the entire building uninhabitable within minutes. Nilo, the Lin said, her voice tight with controlled panic, we're out of time. But as I reached for my keycard to enter the lab, the electronic lock failed completely, its synthetic housing crumbling away to reveal the dead circuits inside. We were locked out of the evidence, and locked in with whatever was spreading through the building's air supply. The emergency exit signs were flickering as their synthetic components began to fail, leaving us in increasingly unstable lighting as we tried to navigate back toward the East Wing. And in the distance, barely audible over the building's groaning structure, I could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. The figure in the hazmat suit looked up as I approached the lab window, and I felt my world tilt sideways. It was Ezra. She was collecting samples from my containment unit with practiced precision, her movements suggesting she'd done this before. The orange mist I'd seen wasn't just random corrosion product. It was being deliberately dispersed through the lab's ventilation system. Nilo? Thalen's voice came through my respirator comm, tight with confusion. Why is Ezra in your lab? We evacuated everyone to the East Wing. I couldn't answer immediately. My mind was processing too many contradictions at once. Ezra, who'd been cooperative during the evacuation. Ezra, who'd had access to the building's environmental monitoring systems. Ezra, who'd been the one to suggest I run my synthesis experiment overnight to avoid contaminating daytime readings. Ezra, who was now carefully sealing sample containers while my life's work dissolved around her. She's not collecting samples, I said finally. She's dispersing them. The hazmat suit turned toward our observation window, and even through the protective gear, I could see Ezra's expression. Not surprise or fear, but calculation. She'd been waiting for us to come back. The overnight lab access, I continued, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. The fragmentary records. Ezra's the one who circumvented my containment protocols. Thalen's atmospheric readings were climbing exponentially, her equipment screaming warnings that the air was becoming toxic. But she was staring at the lab with the same sick realization I was experiencing. This wasn't sabotage, she said. This was a field test. Through the lab's internal speakers, systems that still functioned because they used older copper wiring, Ezra's voice came through clearly. Nilo, I know you're watching. We need to talk. She gestured toward the lab's emergency communication panel, its red light blinking steadily. The building's intercom system was still operational, hardwired through the original construction's metal conduits. Against every survival instinct, I activated the comm system. Talk about what, Ezra? How you turned my research into a weapon. Your research? Her laugh was bitter, distorted through the hazmat suit's filters. Nilo, you've been working with a modified version of my synthesis process for 8 months. The neural network modeling, the polymer matrix calculations. Did you really think you developed those independently? The building shuddered around us, another section of synthetic infrastructure failing. But I barely noticed. 8 months ago, Ezra had started sending me collaborative suggestions for my containment research. Improvements to my molecular modeling. More efficient synthesis pathways. Improvements that had led directly to creating an agent capable of destroying synthetic materials at the molecular level. You've been feeding me the components, I said, using my lab to develop what you couldn't create in your own workspace. What we couldn't create legally, she corrected. Defense applications require certain regulatory bypasses. Having a civilian researcher accidentally discover the process gives us plausible deniability. Defense applications. The conversations I'd overheard in the West Wing suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't an industrial accident. It was a demonstration. The military contracts, Delin said, her voice dead with realization. The ones the facility has been pursuing. They weren't for materials testing. Smart girl. Ezra was sealing the last of her sample containers, preparing to leave. Do you have any idea what a selective infrastructure weapon is worth? Something that can disable an entire city's synthetic-dependent systems without harming organic life. Through the lab window, I could see the orange mist spreading through the ventilation system with increasing density. But it wasn't just spreading randomly. It was following specific airflow patterns, targeting areas with the highest concentrations of synthetic materials. The atmospheric readings, I said. You've been controlling the dispersion rate. Had to make it look like an accident, Ezra replied. But we needed enough atmospheric concentration to demonstrate effectiveness. The observers in those helicopters require compelling data. Observers. The unmarked vehicles outside weren't emergency response, they were buyers. You're selling it, Delin said. Right now. Using our facility as a showcase. Using your facility as a testing ground, Ezra corrected. Though I admit, the timing is unfortunate for you both. The building's structural groaning was getting worse, and I could see cracks spreading through the concrete walls. Cracks that followed the paths of synthetic reinforcement rods as they weakened and failed. How long do we have? I asked. Before the building becomes structurally unsound? Maybe 20 minutes. Before the atmospheric concentration becomes lethal? She checked her own detection equipment. About the same. 20 minutes. Enough time to evacuate to the East Wing if the corridors held. Enough time to get everyone out alive if we moved immediately. But not enough time to stop her from completing her demonstration. The neutralization process, I said desperately. There has to be a way to reverse the molecular breakdown. Oh, there is. Ezra's voice carried a note of satisfaction. I developed the neutralization agent 6 months ago. It's actually quite elegant. A simple molecular inhibitor that prevents further polymer matrix degradation. Then use it. Stop this before it kills people. Can't do that, Nilo. The buyers need to see the full demonstration cycle. Besides, the neutralization agent is valuable too. Countries that purchase the weapon will also need the antidote. My hands were shaking with rage and desperation. She'd turned my containment research into both a weapon and its antidote, creating a market for synthetic destruction and synthetic protection simultaneously. You're insane, Delin said through the comm. This could spread beyond the facility. Atmospheric particulates don't respect property boundaries. Actually, they do. Ezra was checking her equipment one final time, preparing to leave through the lab's emergency exit. The corrosion agent has a limited atmospheric half-life without continuous synthesis. About 6 hours in open air before it breaks down into harmless components. 6 hours. Long enough to destroy a targeted area's synthetic infrastructure. Short enough to prevent global contamination. Long enough to kill everyone in this building if we didn't evacuate immediately. The people in the East Wing, I said. Whatever your demonstration requires, they don't deserve to die for it. No one has to die, Nilo. The evacuation protocols are real. Get everyone out of the building, and you'll all be fine. This is just infrastructure damage. Just infrastructure damage. As if the building collapsing around us was acceptable collateral for her weapons demonstration. What about Vale? Delin asked. The conversations we heard. Vale knows exactly what's happening, Ezra replied. He's been coordinating with the potential buyers since this morning. The emergency services outside? Half of them are military contractors evaluating the weapon's effectiveness. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Vale, who'd been my supervisor for 3 years, who'd encouraged my containment research, who'd known exactly what Ezra was planning to do with my work. How many people are in on this? I asked. Enough to ensure the demonstration proceeds as planned. Ezra was moving toward the lab's emergency exit, her sample containers secured in a protective case. But not everyone. Most of the staff are genuinely unaware. They'll make convincing witnesses to the accidental nature of the incident. Convincing witnesses. We were all props in her demonstration, our terror and confusion adding authenticity to what would be reported as an industrial accident. The building shuddered violently, and through the observation window, I could see sections of the lab's synthetic flooring beginning to buckle and crack. The support structure was failing faster than Ezra had calculated. 20 minutes might have been optimistic, she said, and for the first time, I heard uncertainty in her voice. The molecular cascade is accelerating beyond the modeled parameters. What does that mean? The Lin demanded. It means the corrosion agent is adapting faster than predicted, breaking down synthetic materials more efficiently as it encounters new polymer types. The thing I'd feared in part 2 was happening. The agent was learning, becoming more effective with each new material it encountered. But unlike my theoretical concerns, this was happening in real time, in a building full of people. How long do we actually have? I asked. Ezra checked her readings again, and the pause before she answered told me everything I needed to know. Maybe 10 minutes before structural collapse. Less if the main support columns fail. 10 minutes to evacuate 50 people from a building with increasingly unstable corridors and failing emergency systems. The neutralization agent, I said urgently. Where is it? Secured off-site. The buyers want to see complete effectiveness before purchasing the countermeasure. Of course, she wasn't going to neutralize her own demonstration. Through the comm system, I could hear alarms beginning to sound throughout the building. Not the synthetic emergency systems, which had failed, but the older mechanical warning bells that operated on simple electrical circuits. That's the structural integrity monitoring, the Lin said, checking her tablet. The building's framework is approaching critical failure thresholds. Time to go, Ezra said through the comm. I suggest you evacuate with the others. The exit routes should remain stable for another few minutes. Should remain stable? I repeated. You don't actually know. The modeling was based on controlled laboratory conditions, she admitted. Real-world applications sometimes exceed theoretical parameters. Real-world applications. She was talking about people's lives like they were data points in her weapons demonstration. The lab's emergency exit sealed behind Ezra with a hydraulic hiss. One of the few systems still functioning, because it operated on mechanical pressure rather than synthetic components. Through the observation window, I could see her moving quickly through the exterior corridor, heading toward what I assumed was a secure extraction point. We need to get to the east wing, the Lin said, her atmospheric readings now showing toxicity levels that would cause respiratory damage within minutes of exposure. Everyone needs to evacuate immediately. But as we turned toward the corridor that would take us to safety, I heard something that stopped me cold. Voices from the west wing. The same arguing voices we'd heard before, but closer now. Coming toward us. Buildings failing faster than projected. Buyers are getting nervous about the uncontrolled variables. Need to extract the primary researchers before total structural collapse. Primary researchers. They were talking about us. The Lin, I said quietly. I don't think we're supposed to evacuate with everyone else. She looked at me with growing alarm. What do you mean? I think we're part of the demonstration. The researchers who accidentally created the agent. Our testimony about how the containment failed would add credibility to the cover story. But if we're dead, we're not supposed to die. We're supposed to be rescued at the last possible moment, grateful for the intervention of the emergency response team. The voices were getting closer, and I could make out individual words now. They were coordinating an extraction, timing it to maximize the drama of pulling us from a collapsing building. But their timing was based on Ezra's original calculations, and she'd just admitted the corrosion was proceeding faster than modeled. They're going to wait too long, I said. The building's going to collapse before they extract us. Then we leave now, the Lin said firmly. Forget the evacuation protocols. Forget whatever they planned. We get out through whatever route is still stable. She was right. We needed to move immediately, before the extraction team arrived to rescue. us at precisely the wrong moment. But as we started toward the main corridor, the building's structure gave a deep, ominous groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Through the windows, I could see the exterior walls beginning to bow outward as the synthetic reinforcement failed. And in the distance, the sound of approaching helicopters was getting louder. The extraction was beginning, and we were running out of time to escape it. "East Wing," I said. "Now," before they seal the building for their dramatic rescue. We started running through corridors that were increasingly unstable, past walls that cracked and shifted as synthetic components failed throughout the structure. Behind us, I could hear the coordinated voices of the extraction team moving through the building, calling out in voices that sounded genuinely concerned for our safety. Voices that would ensure we survived long enough to become witnesses to what would be reported as a tragic accident. An accident that would be used to sell weapons to the highest bidder. The East Wing evacuation was chaos. 50 people crowded into corridors designed for maybe 20, their voices echoing off concrete walls as synthetic ceiling panels collapsed around us. The emergency lighting had failed. Those fixtures used polymer housings that were dissolving like sugar in rain, leaving us with whatever flashlights and phone lights still functioned. "Stay together." Vale's voice cut through the panic, but I couldn't see him in the crush of bodies. "Single file toward the main exit." Single file. In corridors where the synthetic flooring was buckling under our feet and chunks of dissolved insulation rained down from overhead. People stumbled over debris that hadn't existed an hour ago, their breathing harsh through improvised masks made from whatever fabric they could find. The Lynn pressed close beside me, her atmospheric detector screaming warnings that the air was approaching toxicity levels that would cause permanent lung damage. The orange mist wasn't just spreading, it was concentrating, drawn into enclosed spaces where synthetic materials created the richest target environment. "The ventilation system," she gasped through her respirator. "It's pulling the agent deeper into the building instead of clearing it." Of course. The ductwork was lined with synthetic materials that were now breaking down, creating a feedback loop that concentrated the corrosive agent throughout the facility's interior spaces. What should have been our protection was becoming our trap. How long before? I started to ask, but the building answered for me. A section of the ceiling collapsed 20 feet ahead, synthetic support beams crumbling like wet cardboard as they lost structural integrity. The impact sent a cloud of orange-tinted dust billowing through the corridor, and people began coughing and retching as they inhaled the particulate matter. "Back!" someone shouted. "Everyone back!" But there was nowhere to go back to. The corridor behind us was equally compromised, and side passages were blocked by debris from previous collapses. We were trapped in a shrinking pocket of increasingly toxic air, listening to the building dissolve around us. That's when I heard Vale's voice coming from a different direction entirely. "Extraction proceeding as planned. Buyers are satisfied with the demonstration." He wasn't with the evacuation. He was somewhere else in the building, coordinating with the team I'd overheard. The realization hit me like ice water. Vale had never intended to evacuate with us. He was managing the crisis from a safe distance, ensuring the demonstration proceeded according to plan. "The Lynn," I whispered, pulling her aside as the crowd pressed forward. "Vale's not here." She looked around the packed corridor with growing alarm. "What do you mean?" "He was just..." "Listen." His voice came again, faint but audible through the building's failing intercom system. "Structural failure accelerating beyond parameters. May need to adjust extraction timeline." Extraction timeline. The emergency response outside wasn't here to save everyone. They were here to extract specific personnel at precise moments to maximize the demonstration's impact. "We're not supposed to escape," I said. "We're supposed to be rescued. Dramatically. At the last possible moment." But the last possible moment was approaching faster than anyone had calculated. Another section of ceiling gave way, this time directly over the crowd. I watched in horror as Dr. Martinez from the chemistry department disappeared under a pile of dissolved synthetic debris, his screams cut short by the impact. 3 other researchers rushed to dig him out, but the material was too toxic to touch with bare hands. "We need hazmat gear," someone shouted. "The emergency equipment," another voice called back. "Storage room B7. But I knew storage room B7. Half the emergency equipment there used synthetic components, respirators with plastic filters, protective suits made from polymer materials, decontamination chemicals stored in synthetic containers. By now, most of it would be useless sludge. The crowd was fracturing into smaller groups, people making desperate individual decisions about which route might offer survival. Some pushed toward what remained of the main exit. Others tried to break into offices with windows, hoping to escape through the building's exterior. That's when the Lynn grabbed my arm. "The loading dock," she said urgently. "It's in the oldest part of the building. Concrete and steel construction, minimal synthetic materials." She was right. The loading dock dated back to the facility's original construction, before synthetic reinforcement became standard. If any part of the building was going to remain structurally sound, it would be there. But it was also in the opposite direction from where everyone else was heading. "The others," I started to say. "Can't help them if we're dead," she interrupted. "And someone needs to survive to expose what really happened here." Another ceiling collapse punctuated her words, this one accompanied by the sharp crack of concrete as the building's framework began to fail. Through the emergency lighting's intermittent glow, I could see orange mist seeping through cracks in the walls themselves. The agent was breaking down synthetic components embedded in the building's very structure. We pushed against the flow of people, fighting our way toward the loading dock through corridors that groaned and shifted around us. The air was thick with particulate matter, and even through our improvised masks, I could taste the metallic bitterness of dissolved polymers. Behind us, the voices of the trapped researchers grew fainter as we moved deeper into the building's deteriorating interior. I tried not to think about Dr. Martinez or the others who might be trapped under debris that was too dangerous to move. The loading dock access was a heavy steel door that had resisted the building's synthetic improvements over the years. When I pulled it open, blessed cool air flowed in from the exterior, air that didn't burn the lungs or taste like chemical death. But as we stumbled through the doorway, I realized we weren't alone. 3 figures in full hazmat suits were positioned near the loading dock's exterior entrance, their attention focused on monitoring equipment that tracked the building's structural degradation in real time. They weren't rescue personnel. Their gear was too sophisticated, too specialized. They were observers. The buyers Ezra had mentioned, watching the demonstration from close range while maintaining safe distance from the effects. One of them turned as we emerged from the building, and I could see surprise in their body language. "We weren't supposed to be here. We weren't part of the planned extraction scenario. Unauthorized personnel," the figure said into a radio. "Researchers have deviated from expected evacuation routes." Expected evacuation routes. They'd been tracking our movements, predicting where we would go based on their crisis management calculations. Our decision to head for the loading dock had disrupted their carefully choreographed demonstration. "Should we intervene?" another observer asked. "Negative. Let the scenario play out naturally. Document any variations from the modeled behavior." Document variations. We were lab rats whose unexpected behavior was being recorded for future reference. That's when the building's main support structure finally gave way. The sound was like thunder, but deeper, a bass note that seemed to come from the earth itself as tons of concrete and steel collapsed inward. Through the loading dock's windows, I could see the facility's central section folding in on itself, floors pancaking together as the synthetic reinforcement that had held them apart dissolved into useless sludge. The researchers who'd been trapped in the East Wing evacuation were now buried under what had been their workplace just hours earlier. "Jesus Christ," the Lynn whispered, staring at the destruction. "Structural collapse complete," one of the observers reported into their radio. "Casualty count appears higher than projected, but demonstration parameters were achieved." Casualty count. They were talking about our colleagues, our friends, like they were acceptable losses in a business presentation. "The neutralization agent," I said, turning toward the observers. "You have it. Use it now." The lead figure's helmet turned toward me, and I could see my reflection in their visor, smoke-stained, desperate, furious. "I'm sorry, who are you?" they asked. "I'm the researcher who created the compound you just used to kill 50 people, I said. "And I know you have the neutralization agent." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," the figure replied smoothly. "We're emergency response personnel documenting this tragic industrial accident." Industrial accident. The cover story was already in place. But before I could respond, Thalen's atmospheric detector began screaming a new type of warning. Not toxicity, but explosive gas concentrations. The orange mist wasn't just corroding synthetic materials anymore. It was creating volatile chemical combinations as it broke down different polymer types simultaneously. "Secondary explosion risk," she said, checking her readings with growing alarm. "The chemical breakdown is producing flammable gas mixtures. If there's any ignition source, The building's emergency backup generators chose that moment to kick in, their electrical systems creating the exact type of spark that could turn the toxic atmosphere into an inferno. "Everyone down," I shouted, but the explosion was already building. The remaining sections of the facility disappeared in a ball of orange flame as the accumulated gases ignited all at once. The shockwave knocked us flat against the loading dock's concrete floor, our ears ringing from the blast. When I could see again, there was nothing left of the facility but burning debris and toxic smoke. Any researchers who might have survived the initial collapse were now certainly dead. The observers were already packing their equipment, their demonstration complete. They'd gotten everything they needed: footage of a synthetic material destroying agent in action, documentation of its effects on infrastructure, and confirmation that the neutralization agent was an essential countermeasure. They'd also gotten a body count that would make their weapons seem appropriately dangerous to potential buyers. 47 confirmed fatalities, the lead observer reported into their radio as they prepared to leave. Demonstration parameters exceeded expectations. Recommend immediate transition to production phase. 47 people, including Dr. Martinez, who'd been trying to help develop safer containment protocols, including the maintenance staff who'd been working late to repair the building's aging infrastructure, including researchers whose only crime had been showing up to work on the wrong day. All of them dead to prove that Ezra's weapon worked as advertised. "You can't just leave," the Lin said, struggling to stand. "There are people in there." "We're people in there," the observer corrected. "This is now a contamination zone requiring specialized cleanup. Emergency services are being notified that the building is structurally unsound and chemically hazardous." Emergency services. The real emergency services, not the military contractors who'd been observing the demonstration. They would arrive to find a completed disaster, with no survivors to contradict the official story of an industrial accident. "Except for us. The neutralization agent," I said again. "At least use it to stop the spread. The contamination could reach." "Actually, it won't," the lead observer interrupted. "The agent has a 6-hour atmospheric half-life. By morning, this will just be the site of a tragic chemical fire with no unusual environmental hazards." They were leaving, walking away from 47 bodies and the burning remains of a facility they'd helped destroy, satisfied that their weapons demonstration had been successful. "Wait," I called after them. "What about?" But they were already gone, disappearing into unmarked vehicles that drove away without sirens or emergency lights. Just another group of observers leaving the scene of someone else's tragedy. The Lin and I stood alone in the loading dock, watching our workplace burn while toxic smoke billowed into the night sky. In the distance, I could hear real emergency sirens approaching, fire departments and hazmat teams who would arrive to find exactly what they'd been told to expect. An industrial accident, a chemical fire, a building that collapsed due to structural failure. Nothing that would suggest weapons development or military contractors or demonstrations for international buyers. Nothing that would contradict the official story that was already being written. "We're the only ones left," the Lin said quietly. "The only ones who know what really happened," I agreed. But as we watched the facility burn, I realized something that made my blood run cold. We weren't just witnesses to Ezra's demonstration. We were loose ends. And people who developed weapons for military contractors didn't usually leave loose ends untied. The sound of approaching helicopters was getting louder, but these weren't emergency response aircraft. These were the extraction choppers, coming to collect the observers who documented their successful demonstration. Coming to clean up any remaining evidence of what had really happened here tonight, including us. The loading dock's steel door slammed shut behind us, sealing out the screams from the main evacuation route. My hands shook as I checked the atmospheric readings on Thalen's detector. The orange mist was everywhere now, eating through synthetic materials faster than we could track. "The broadcast equipment," I said, pointing toward the facility's old communications array mounted on the loading dock's concrete wall. "If we can get a signal out." "With what?" The Lin interrupted, her voice raw from breathing contaminated air. "The satellite uplink uses polymer-shielded cables. The radio transmitter has synthetic components in the circuit boards. Half this equipment is probably slagged by now." She was right. I could see rust spreading across the radio housing like a living thing, the metal casing bubbling and warping as trace synthetic elements in the alloy broke down. Even the supposedly steel and concrete loading dock was compromised. Modern construction always included synthetic reinforcement, plastic conduits, polymer gaskets. The landline, I said desperately. Copper wire, ceramic insulators. Nilo. The Lynn grabbed my shoulder, her grip tight enough to bruise. Look. Through the loading dock's high windows, I could see the facility's main structure collapsing in slow motion. Not the dramatic explosion I'd been expecting, but something worse. A gradual dissolution as the synthetic reinforcement holding up 8 floors simply ceased to exist. Walls sagged inward, floors buckled, and through the smoke-stained glass I could see people trapped between levels as the building folded in on itself like wet cardboard. Ezra was in there somewhere. So was Dr. Martinez from chemistry. So were 43 other researchers whose only crime had been showing up to work on the wrong day. We have to help them, I said, moving toward the door. With what? Thalen's detector shrieked another warning as the contamination level spiked. The air in there is approaching lethal toxicity. We'd be dead before we reached the first victim. But I couldn't just stand here and watch. These were my colleagues, my friends. People who trusted that our work would make the world safer, not. The landline phone rang. Both of us froze. Who would be calling a loading dock phone during a facility-wide emergency? I picked up the handset with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Hello? Nilo? The voice was distorted by static, but unmistakably Ezra's. Jesus, thank God someone's there. Listen carefully, I don't have much time. Ezra, where are you? The building's coming down and... I'm in sub-basement 3, in the old server room. The one with the analog backup systems. Her voice cut in and out as the connection deteriorated. I've been monitoring everything. The contamination, the evacuations, the Christ Nilo, this wasn't an accident. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? The corrosion agent. It didn't escape from our lab. Someone released it deliberately. I've been tracking the dispersal pattern. It's too uniform, too controlled. This was a weapons test. The loading dock felt like it was spinning around me. That's impossible. Our research was purely defensive. Our research, yes, but not theirs. Static crackled across the line. I've been monitoring communications, military contractors, international buyers. They've been watching this whole thing unfold like it was a fucking demonstration. Through the windows, I could see helicopters circling at a safe distance, their spotlights illuminating the destruction below. Not rescue helicopters, observation platforms, documenting the effectiveness of a weapon that was dissolving an entire building in real time. The neutralization agent, I said. Tell me you still have it. That's why I'm calling. Ezra's voice was barely audible now. The formula's stored on the analog servers down here. But the access codes, they're on a synthetic storage device that's already corrupted. I can't retrieve the data. So we're fucked. Not necessarily. A long pause filled with electronic interference. The backup codes are in Vale's office safe. Physical paper documents, stored in a steel container. But someone would have to. The line went dead. I stared at the handset, listening to empty static, then slammed it back onto its cradle. Vale's office safe. The neutralization codes are there. Thalen's face went white. Vale's office is on the 4th floor, in the middle of the worst contamination zone. Then that's where we're going. Are you insane? She pointed at her atmospheric detector, which was screaming warnings about toxic exposure levels. The air up there would kill us in minutes. The floors probably can't even support our weight anymore. 43 people are trapped in that building, I said. If we can get those codes to Ezra, she can synthesize the neutralization agent. Stop the contamination before it spreads beyond the facility. And if we die trying, then we die trying. But even as I said it, I knew the math was wrong. The building was collapsing too fast. Even if we reached Vale's safe, even if we got the codes to Ezra, even if she could synthesize the agent, it would take hours to produce enough to neutralize the contamination. Hours we didn't have. The people trapped inside would be dead long before any rescue could reach them. There's another option, the Lynn said quietly. What? She pointed toward a red emergency panel mounted on the loading dock's far wall. Building-wide fire suppression system. If we trigger it manually, the water pressure might. My what? Wash the contamination into the groundwater? Spread it to surrounding buildings? I shook my head. That's not neutralization, that's just making the problem bigger. But it might save the people still trapped inside. Or it might kill them faster. We don't know how the agent reacts to water. What if it becomes airborne when diluted? What if? What if we stop overthinking and start acting? Thalen's voice cracked with frustration. Those people are dying right now, Nilo. right now while we're debating theoretical consequences. She was right, but so was I. Every choice led to disaster, just different kinds of disaster, with different body counts and different long-term consequences. That's when I realized what this was really about. It's not about saving everyone, I said slowly. It's about choosing who to save. The Lin nodded grimly. The people trapped inside, or the people who might be contaminated if this spreads. Ezra in the sub-basement, or our colleagues on the upper floors. Local containment or global exposure. We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the building collapse around us while emergency sirens wailed in the distance. Through the windows, I could see the observation helicopters maintaining their careful distance, documenting our facility's destruction with professional detachment. 43 people were going to die tonight. The only question was whether they'd be the only ones. The safe, I said finally. We go for the neutralization codes. Even if we can't save the people inside, we can prevent this from spreading. That's not a choice, the Lin said. That's just choosing the greater good over the immediate good. Sometimes that's all the choice you get. But as we prepared to enter the dying building, I realized there was a third option I hadn't considered. One that would ensure the neutralization codes reached the right people, even if we didn't survive to deliver them personally. The emergency broadcast system, I said, pointing to a red phone mounted beside the fire suppression controls. It's designed to reach emergency services automatically. If we can access the codes and transmit them, Ezra would still need time to synthesize the agent, time the trapped people don't have. But other facilities would have the formula. Other researchers could implement countermeasures before this weapon gets deployed again. Because that's what this was really about. Not just our facility, not just tonight's casualties, but preventing future demonstrations, future weapons tests, future buildings full of innocent people dissolving in orange mist. Both, the Lin said suddenly. We do both. What? You go for the safe. Get the codes, transmit them through the emergency system. I trigger the fire suppression, try to buy the trapped people more time. That's suicide. The suppression system controls are right next to the worst contamination zone. So is Vale's office. She was right. We were both volunteering for suicide missions. The only difference was which type of death we preferred, quick toxicity exposure or slow structural collapse. There has to be another way, I said. But even as I said it, I could hear the building's death throes accelerating, metal groaning, concrete cracking, voices calling for help from places we could never reach in time. The Lin was already moving toward the fire suppression controls, her atmospheric detector screaming warnings about the contamination levels near the building's interior connection. Promise me something, she said without looking back. What? If this works, if people survive this, make sure they know it wasn't an accident. Make sure they know someone turned our research into a weapon. The Lin, promise me. I promise. She reached for the fire suppression controls, then stopped. One more thing. If I don't make it out, you'll make it. If I don't make it out, she continued, tell my sister that I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to fix the mistake we made by trusting the wrong people. Then she was gone, disappearing through the interior door into air so toxic it would burn her lungs with every breath. I stood alone in the loading dock, listening to the building die around me, knowing I had maybe 10 minutes before the upper floors became completely inaccessible. 10 minutes to reach Vale's safe, retrieve codes that might not even work, and transmit them to people who might not be able to act on them in time. 10 minutes to prevent our research from becoming the blueprint for a new generation of infrastructure weapons. 10 minutes to ensure that 43 deaths tonight wouldn't become 43,000 deaths tomorrow. I grabbed the emergency respirator from the loading dock's safety station, its synthetic filter already beginning to corrode, and headed for the stairs that would take me into the heart of the contamination zone. Behind me, I could hear the fire suppression system activating, water pressure building in pipes that might not survive long enough to deliver their payload. Ahead of me, for floors of dissolving building waited in orange-tinted darkness. And somewhere in the sub-basement, Ezra was counting on me to retrieve the codes that could stop this from happening again. I started climbing. The stairwell air burned my lungs, even through the failing respirator filter. Each step upward felt like breathing liquid fire, the orange mist so thick now it clung to my clothes like acid fog. The synthetic components in my shoes were already softening, leaving sticky residue on each concrete step. By the second floor, I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The emergency lighting had failed, not from power loss, but because the synthetic housings around the LED fixtures had simply dissolved, exposing live wires that sparked and died in the contaminated air. I felt my way up the stairs by touch, following the concrete handrail that was one of the few materials still holding its shape. The metal support brackets had begun to bubble and warp where they contained trace synthetic compounds, but the rail itself remained solid. Third floor. The corridor was a nightmare of sagging ceiling tiles and drooping wall panels. I could hear water from Thalen's fire suppression system cascading through the floors above, but instead of helping, it seemed to accelerate the contamination somehow. The orange mist grew thicker wherever water mixed with the airborne agent. I tried not to think about what that meant for everyone still trapped up there. Fourth floor. Vale's office was at the end of the east corridor, or had been. Half the hallway was gone now, the floor buckling inward where synthetic reinforcement had failed. I crawled across the sagging surface, feeling it flex dangerously under my weight. The office door had collapsed inward, leaving a triangular gap I could squeeze through. Inside, Vale's desk had partially melted, its polymer surface forming abstract sculptures of decay. But the steel safe in the corner looked intact. I tried the combination Vale had given me during last month's safety briefing, the one we all pretended to memorize and immediately forgot. Nothing. The mechanism felt sticky, corroded. That's when I noticed my hands were bleeding. The respirator filter had failed completely, and the contaminated air was caustic enough to burn exposed skin. I had maybe 5 minutes before the toxicity overwhelmed my system. Second combination attempt. Still nothing. Through the office windows, I could see the observation helicopters still circling, their cameras documenting everything. Professional observers watching a weapons demonstration unfold in real time, measuring effectiveness, calculating casualty rates. Third attempt. The safe clicked open. Inside were 3 manila folders marked with radiation symbols, old-school physical documents that had survived the digital apocalypse happening around us. I grabbed all 3, stuffing them inside my jacket as the building groaned ominously overhead. That's when the floor gave way. I fell through 2 levels of collapsing structure, landing hard in what had been the chemistry lab. My left leg twisted wrong on impact, sending white-hot pain up my spine. Around me, the remains of our research equipment lay scattered like metallic confetti. Everything synthetic dissolved, everything metal corroded beyond recognition. But my radio was still working. Ancient analog electronics, built before anyone thought to optimize with synthetic components. Ezra, I gasped into the handset. Can you hear me? Static, then her voice weak but clear. Nilo? Where are you? Chemistry lab. I've got the codes. I tried to stand and nearly passed out from the pain in my leg. But I can't get to you. The stairs are gone. Read them to me. I've got the synthesis equipment running. With hands that felt like raw meat, I opened the first folder. Formula designation Lima 77. Neutralization sequence begins with. The technical specifications blurred together as my vision wavered from toxic exposure. Chemical compounds, reaction temperatures, catalysis requirements. Everything Ezra needed to create an antidote to the weapon we'd accidentally unleashed. Got it, she said after I'd recited all 3 documents. Beginning synthesis now. Nilo, you need to get out of there. Working on it. But we both knew I wasn't. The building was collapsing around me, the contamination was eating through my protective gear, and my leg wouldn't support my weight. How long until you have something? 4 hours minimum. Maybe 6. 4 hours. The people trapped in the upper floors would be dead in 30 minutes. The contamination would spread to the nearby town by dawn. And somewhere in the distance, the observation helicopters were already turning away, having documented everything they needed to see. Ezra, I said, there's something else. This wasn't an accident. Silence on the radio. The contamination release was deliberate. A weapons test. The buyers have been watching everything. I know, she said quietly. I've been monitoring their communications. They're calling it a complete success. The floor beneath me shuddered as another section of the building collapsed. Through the holes in the ceiling, I could see orange mist swirling in patterns that looked almost organic, almost alive. The emergency broadcast system, I said. We need to get this information to. Already done. I've been transmitting everything to the CDC, EPA, and Defense Department for the last hour. Her voice cracked with exhaustion. Whether they'll act on it is another question. That's when I heard them, voices calling from somewhere above me. Survivors, still alive in the wreckage, still hoping someone would find them before the toxic air finished what the building collapse had started. I looked at my radio, then at the holes in the ceiling. With my injured leg, there was no way I could reach them. But maybe I could guide them toward me, toward the chemistry lab where the air was slightly less toxic. "This is Nilo," I broadcast on the emergency frequency. "If anyone can hear this, I'm in the main chemistry lab, ground floor. The air here is clearer. Follow my voice." For 20 minutes, I kept talking, describing landmarks, warning about unstable areas, guiding anyone who could still move toward the only safe zone left in the building. 7 people made it down, researchers I'd worked with for years, now covered in chemical burns and barely conscious from toxic exposure. By the time the Lynn found us, the neutralization agent was ready. She appeared in the lab doorway like a ghost, her protective suit partially melted, her face mask cracked but still functional. Behind her came 3 emergency responders in hazmat gear, carrying equipment I'd never seen before. "Military Chemical Response Team," she explained, helping me to my feet. Apparently someone took Ezra's transmissions seriously. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of decontamination procedures, medical treatment, and debriefing sessions. The neutralization agent worked, slowly, incompletely, but it worked. The orange mist gradually dissipated, the corrosion stopped spreading, and the immediate crisis passed. But the questions remained. Sitting in the decontamination facility 3 days later, I watched news reports about industrial accidents and experimental containment failures. Official statements from corporate executives explaining how new safety protocols would prevent future incidents. No mention of weapons testing. No mention of deliberate release. No mention of the observation helicopters that documented everything before disappearing into bureaucratic classification. Ezra sat across from me, her hands bandaged from chemical exposure, but her eyes sharp with anger. "They're calling it accidental contamination. Corporate negligence, not weapons development. What about the communications you intercepted? Classified. National security concerns." She gestured at the television where a government spokesperson was explaining how the facility would be demolished and rebuilt with better safety systems. "They're treating this as a research accident, not an attack." The Lynn joined us, walking carefully on crutches. The fire suppression system had bought the trapped researchers enough time for rescue, but the contaminated water had caused third-degree burns on anyone exposed to it. She'd saved 14 lives and nearly lost her own in the process. "Any word on the neutralization formula?" she asked. "That's the interesting part," Ezra said. "They're classifying it too. Apparently it's now a state secret." We sat in silence, watching the news coverage sanitize our disaster into a manageable narrative. Industrial accident. Heroic response. Lessons learned. Nothing that would interfere with synthetic materials markets or international weapons agreements. Through the decontamination facility's windows, I could see construction crews already working on the site where our building had stood. Not cleanup crews, construction crews, laying foundation work for something new. Something that would undoubtedly incorporate lessons learned from watching our research turn into a weapon. "They'll do it again," I said. "Different location, different researchers, but they'll do it again." "Maybe," Dylan said. "Or maybe word will get out. Maybe enough people will ask the right questions." But even as she said it, I could see she didn't believe it. We all knew how these things worked. The official story would become the accepted truth. The real story would disappear into classified files and non-disclosure agreements. And somewhere, in laboratories we'd never see, other researchers would continue our work without knowing what it would be used for. The facility psychologist called it survivor guilt, the tendency to feel responsible for disasters we couldn't have prevented. But I knew it wasn't guilt, it was knowledge. The knowledge that we'd helped create something terrible, and that our survival meant we'd live to see it deployed again. 2 weeks later, I saw the first news reports about synthetic material failures in manufacturing plants across 3 states. Brief items buried in business sections, explaining temporary shutdowns due to quality control issues. The kind of reports you'd miss unless you knew what to look for. I called Ezra. "Are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it, but I'm also seeing something else." She paused. "Remember those international buyers you mentioned? The ones monitoring our disaster?" "Yeah. 3 of them have gone completely dark. No communications, no financial activity, no travel records. Either they're dead, or someone decided they knew too much." I stared at the news report on my screen, watching stock prices fluctuate as investors tried to understand why synthetic materials companies were suddenly experiencing coordinated failures. The market confusion looked random, but the pattern was unmistakable if you knew what had happened at our facility. It's spreading, I said. Or being spread, Ezra corrected. The question is whether it's accidental contamination from our site or deliberate deployment of the weapon. Does it matter? It matters to the people who die from it. She was right, but sitting in my apartment, watching the world slowly realize that synthetic materials were no longer reliable, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd already lost the war. Not the battle to stop one disaster, but the war to prevent our research from becoming a tool of mass destruction. The orange mist was gone from our facility, but it lived on in classified files and military budgets. The neutralization formula existed, but only in laboratories we couldn't access. The truth was documented, but buried under official narratives that would never change. We'd survived the immediate crisis, contained the local contamination, and saved as many lives as we could. But somewhere in the world, someone was preparing for the next demonstration. And next time, they'd know exactly how long it takes to synthesize an antidote.